Good afternoon. Welcome back to a new week of U.S. History. AP, working on this, having some fun. It's going to be cool. So I'm glad to be back with you guys, and Heather is back as well, as she is off cam, helping out in the YouTube chat. Good to have her back as well. Yeah, hopefully you guys had a good weekend. I'm guessing most of you still have schoolwork this week and everything. So, yeah, I'm sorry about that. But maybe you'll be happy to actually have like some kind of normalcy. That's always nice to have some kind of normalcy. So I know my kids are. So here's how we go. We're gonna start up, talk about AP history. AP US history. This is session time period 4, or need to know topic 4. It's not. That's one of the things about the US history, especially how we have it broken down, is it is not all by dates. It's by like general themes, which is actually helpful for us as we now are talking about the new format of our test that came out last week. And to review that, let me pull this up just in case you weren't here earlier. If you weren't here for last week's sessions or didn't get a chance to look at the email from CollegeBoard, CollegeBoard has announced what they're going to be doing. Or to some extent, what they're going to be doing. The exams are going to be home tests. They're going to be 45 minutes long. They will not be covering the last 20%. So the last 2 units, basically anything after World War II is being cut. So, and then you're gonna have 2 different dates to pick from. They're gonna give you tons of different options for how to take the test. Other thing is there's not gonna be any multiple choice questions. It's gonna all be student generated responses. So short answers, essays, those kind of things. We don't know the specifics. April 3rd, 2 weeks from past Friday, they're going to announce more of the specifics of what the test is actually going to look like. But we do know that they have confirmed that there will not be multiple choice on the test. As a result, that kind of changes how we are talking about things together. And those themes end up being very, very important. Just so that you can see what we're talking about when we say these themes, these need to know concepts. These are kind of like overarching concepts, things that you will have that cover a lot of different topics, or a lot of different time periods. So like when you look at US foreign policy, which is what we're covering today, this covers all the way from the late 1700s up until 1945. The immigration and things like that, again, all the way up until 1945. And so one thing, basically, it's up until 1945. After 1945, nothing. So Korean War, Vietnam, Gulf Wars, 9/11, those are things. 9/11 was a high yield topic that they're not going to be doing anymore. And, or at least on this year's test. So be prepared that they're going to have to focus on other things. So I'm looking at foreign policy today. And so how we've ordered this class, how we've set this thing up, is that we're going to talk through some topics, kind of just review some basic structure of content, like as far as like actual like history and lessons and things like that. But then we're going to look at some questions, and I want to show you like how a multiple choice question that you're practicing on could end up helping you as we get into these short answer questions. And I've got for one really good example where we go through and look at the entire time period, and you can see how this could manifest itself. So multiple choice questions are still very useful to practice with, because it's going to make sure you know the content. The way they're probably going to ask this stuff is to have you prove that you know the information by the way you answer the short answer questions. So, foreign policy, this is going to, like I said, this picks up as soon as America becomes a country. Originally, the U.S. was neutral. They wanted to be neutral. They wanted to be uninvolved in international politics. Now dealing with the actual North American continent, that was different. The U.S. would be perfectly content and they had no problem fighting with the American Indians. Anybody that's tried to mess with the U.S. borders, they did all that. They were a minor player. When England came over, War of 1812, that was on our turf. That was on the U.S. turf. U.S. fought it. But it wasn't like they were going to go out and mess around with other people. But then they also were like, well, we're not going to go mess with you, but you better not come mess with us. And that's going to pop up in a little bit here. What major foreign policy issue were people losing their heads over in the 1790s? Losing their heads. French Revolution. Yep. So French Revolution comes cruising along because mostly of the American Revolution. The people were like, hey, those guys just overthrew the most powerful empire on earth. I bet we could do the same thing. And if you remember, the French Revolution also, the French had helped us. They had been our supporters in the Revolutionary War. We had people who fought with us in the Revolutionary War who were now over in France leading the French Revolution. I'm sure if you've seen Hamilton. It's funny how history teachers really have glommed on to the whole Hamilton musical, because it's like, well, now there's something that people will relate to. And so, yeah, it actually is useful. There's some useful stuff in that musical to help you maybe remember some of this stuff. But yeah, it was like, the French wanted the U.S. to help. There was a big fight between different groups over whether or not we should. And even people who had been very supportive of the French involving and involved with our stuff did not want to fight over there. And so you had Washington encourage people to not be involved in foreign entanglements. This was, if you go and read his farewell address, very powerfully said, do not get involved in foreign entanglements. You've got to deal with your own stuff. And so then the French Revolution comes along. Lafayette, who was one of the fighters and apparently one of Alexander Hamilton's drinking buddies, now was going and running, was working with the French Revolution. Everyone assumed Hamilton was going to be for it. He was not. Jefferson was. Fight there, because they were like, well, listen, we barely are a country ourselves, and we have no idea who's going to be in charge over there. So we don't want to get involved. They were listening, those people, Hamilton and the others, were listening to Washington's advice. So this really demonstrated the neutrality. They were like, we're not getting involved. And that was an opportunity where it made sense for them to get involved, or so most people thought. So then we had this thing, the Monroe Doctrine, which is tied in with that. The Monroe Doctrine, it was like America kind of was like feeling where they, they were like, all right, we're more powerful. We at least want to tell people to stay out of our neighborhood. That was like the problem. It was like, all right, we're not going to come and get involved in anything that you're doing over in your area of the town, but you better not come mess with our area of the town. And so we kind of the United States staked claim on the Western Hemisphere. They were just like, anything happening over here, you need to just see your way out. This is an AB conversation, see your way out. And so they're like, anything South America, anything in the Caribbean, we're dealing with it. You're not. Go away. So this is James Monroe's speech in 1823, and this is going to kind of highlight how this neutrality is coming into play and how it's expanding the definition of neutrality. So I want to give you guys a minute to read this part of the speech, and then as you can see, we have 4 different questions about it. And I'm going to show you, like as we're doing these questions, still how we can use that to apply to the larger short answer questions you're going to have on test day. So let me give you a minute, read it, and then we're going to pop back on and talk a little bit. Okie dokie. So if you're reading this, you can see what the points that Monroe is making. First of all, he's saying, listen, we have not messed with you. We have not messed with your colonies. We haven't messed with any of your stuff. But we think that you need to not mess with our stuff either. We don't want you messing with our stuff. That's the first thing he says, is basically, don't come over here. Because if you do, we're going to see that as you infringing on our comfort zone. Then it says, we did not touch any of your stuff, so leave our stuff alone. And then it says, if you do decide to come over here, we're going to have to think that that means that you're trying to start something. So there is an expansion of neutrality. And so thinking along the lines of how we could address this on test day. And they may ask you a question about the changes in American foreign policy between Washington's speech and World War I. I mean, they could do a longer version of that. They could do a shorter version. But they even could have you compare and contrast the Monroe Doctrine and Washington's speech, because there's only like 30 years difference. So in that 30 years, how did their definitions of neutrality, the difference of foreign entanglements, how did that change? And so even in that short period of time, there is a compare and contrast that you could demonstrate. Because Washington's was kind of like, stay out of other people's problems. Monroe is reinterpreting other people's problems. Monroe now is saying, well, our problems, and it's not just our backyard, it's also our neighbor's backyard that we're worried about. So let's look at a couple of questions and make sure that we have that down. So number 13, again, we'll give you a minute to read these questions, and you can give your answer in the chat. And Heather will be glad to talk to you there if you have any questions as well. But let's look at number 13 first, and then we will discuss it. Give you a minute here. Go for it. Technology. Sorry about that. You got to see my email. Okay. So I was just deleting a useless piece of mail. Anyway, back to our question, number 13. Based on the excerpt, which of the following best describes the change in foreign policy in 1823? The change, okay? So it did change between Washington and Monroe. How did it change? So go through, and again, you know, you can eliminate answers. If there were multiple choice on a test, you would eliminate. Elimination is very powerful. Since there's not going to be multiple choice, you're still going to eliminate them as far as getting to the right one. It is going to be answer choice B. I saw quite a few B's in the chat. And so what is the difference between some of these? So A, it talks about America going into Europe. No, we weren't doing that, okay? C and D are too strong. Now, did Monroe ultimately see us doing that, getting rid of the Europeans altogether, or take over those countries? Maybe. But remember, when we're talking about quiz questions on the test, you got to make sure you're answering exactly what they're asking. And that's the change, the stated change between Washington and Monroe was that now the US would act to protect the Western Hemisphere as a whole. But they weren't stated that they were going to go and do those other things. Was that going to happen? Probably. Yeah. Does it happen? Yes. But at the front end, that wasn't the initial change. That was something that was going to pop up down the road. So be careful going, you know, interpreting things and going too far with stuff as well. You got to stick within the framework of what they're asking. All right, number 14. Let me go ahead and give you a minute to work on 14. Here you go. Okie dokie. So the ideals in the Monroe Doctrine augmented the ideals from what? So we just talked about that it was an expansion of George Washington's farewell address of no entangling alliances. So it kind of expanded that to where we're not allying, we're not allying, we're not aligning, we're not aligning with anybody. We're just covering our own tail. Our tail just got really long. That's what it is. So number 15. So how long did the Monroe Doctrine last? How long did the Monroe Doctrine last? Let's go ahead and take a minute to work on that. Seeing some answers coming in, and they're all looking really good. How long did the Monroe Doctrine last? It was going to be until, come on, World War I. Now, Spanish-American War may have been tempting, but remember that still was in the Western Hemisphere. That was still fought in our backyard. And so American participation in World War I, that's the first time that the US goes and actually fights somewhere else and gets involved in something that was not in our backyard. All right, number 16, last one. There were 4 whole questions on this, but it's good because I'll explain why in just a second, okay? So 14, go ahead and take a minute. All right, there's our minute. This one, I think this one was a little bit tougher. People trying to remember exactly when this happened and why. So if you remember, it says right there in the speech was 1823, 1823. And so does that help at all to, kind of narrow things down? So the answer is going to be answer choice B. Answer choice B. So War of 1812, it ends earlier than 1823. And the bigger problem was that some of those, because Spain is pretty much is losing a lot of its influence. And as they're losing some of that, other countries are like, "Ooh, I could come in there and take over this. I could take over that." And then the US is like, no. And then notice also, this is not, well, another way you could think of this is like, well, it was talking about the hemisphere. So it really wasn't talking necessarily about our country. Got to remember, right south of us, there's a lot of Spanish colonies. Like everything down there, everything below the United States is Spanish, but for the most part, except for like Brazil. But there's a lot of Spanish down there. And so that's what they were talking about, was like, hey, every time you come over, it's like every time you come over here, it's like, we're wondering, are you going to stop at some point? How far are you going to go? And it just, the US is like, no, this isn't working. So that's going to be what it was. But this one is tougher. So the thing is what we did 4 questions on the Monroe Doctrine, but look at how we were able to connect things. We were able to connect. So like we've got, we got 1776 here. And so we're heading out this way, and the country is getting bigger, the country is getting stronger. 1823, now we've expanded our influence. So now we're like, hey, now we're going to get involved with anything in the hemisphere. Then we cruise along a little bit more. Next thing you know, we got like 1898. Now we got the Spanish-American War. Then 1911, 1914. Now all of a sudden we're at World War I. You see, these changes are not that far apart, and you can see them shifting constantly. And so a good question they could ask is, what is the, what led to the changes in American foreign policy between Washington's farewell address and Teddy Roosevelt or something like that, you know? And so you could trace that. And so understanding what led to the Monroe Doctrine, what that included, how that helped protect America, but also kind of limited America. And they kept finding ways to expand the Monroe Doctrine and Washington's farewell address without really expanding it. And so knowing all of those things is going to help you on a connections question where they do ask you something like, how does this go from here to here? All right. So moving past that era, closer to 1900, the U.S. neutrality, honestly, it was some of it was self-preservation, and it was like they were young. They were a young country. Even by 1900, they'd been around for 225 years, or no, 125 years. And so, and during that 125 years, there had been a lot of things going on, if in case you don't remember, like the Civil War. There was enough things to worry about. So that they didn't really have the room to go and get involved in other countries. So they eventually, though, found themselves in the place where they had the largest economy in the world by 1900. They were now industrial, whereas some of the major countries in Europe were not. I mean, if you look at like Russia, by the time that the Bolshevik Revolution happened, they still were an agrarian country. And so the US is one of the more advanced countries already by 1900. They're one of the largest economies. They are the largest economy, actually. Their population, they're in 1800, they're 17th in global population. In 1900, they're 4th. And so the country itself is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. The reasons for it, you know, as we mentioned last week, not all of them are great. The fact that they did not pay a labor force for a very long time versus other countries is part of it. Because the South was completely run by non-paid workers, is I guess the nicest term you could use. But the thing is like the US they're growing. They're growing. Uncle Sam is like getting stronger and stronger. He's like, yeah, and he's wanting to like start flexing on people. And so now it's kind of like, well, this mindset of why are we staying out of everything starts to kind of creep in, because the US is starting to realize we could win. We could, you know, have some of these things. And they're kind of like, what they're kind of thinking is this whole, everyone else has an empire, why don't we? Like, what about us? Why shouldn't we have those things? Why shouldn't we have colonies and all of that as well? Especially when we are so large and we have such a big economy, why can't we have those things? And so they start to kind of look around for how we can do this. So we've got post-Spanish-American War. Let's talk about, there's 4 different time periods that you can look at. You've got post-Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War, after that, the US takes over a bunch of Spain's former colonies. It's Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. And so that they start getting their first colonies. Now they also get involved over in China with the Boxer Rebellion. They start getting involved throughout Latin America, more and more, getting the people they want in control. Like Panama is one good example, where they wanted the Panama Canal to be built and they wanted it to be friendly to Americans, so they were able to back somebody who would do that. And so there was an overthrow, and the person that the US wanted ended up being in power. So then the US would have access to the Panama Canal. Then you get to World War I. which is in 1914 to 1918. US comes in later in that process. This is the first big time involvement in an international conflict. They came in, changed the tide of the war, and it's not something that they don't really want to leave right away. Not everyone does. And so, Wilson is proposing this 14 points, this League of Nations, which, ironically enough, the US as a whole is like, no, and they don't approve it. And it's because that mindset of neutrality was still very strong. And so they were like, we want to stay isolationist. We want to stay out of this conflict. And as you're preparing for World War II and you start looking at that, the US stayed out of that for a long time, a very long time. It doesn't seem like a long time when you're looking at like, oh, it's only 2 years. Yeah, but a lot happened in 2 years. I just finished reading a book called The Splendid and the Vile, and it's about the United Kingdom and Churchill during the opening of the war and how close they came to losing. And really, it was the reason the UK did not get taken over by Germany was mostly because Germany did not follow through on trying to take it over. Like if they had done an invasion like everyone assumed they were going to do, if they had kept going with air attacks instead of attacking Russia, it would have been over. And the US held out as long as they could. It wasn't until 1940 that they even agreed to start sending ships and things to the UK, and then at the end of 1941 when the US officially joined after Pearl Harbor. But that isolationist still, it almost cost Roosevelt the election in 1940 because they thought he was going to drag everyone into war, and they didn't want that. And so that you can, again, going back and looking at how does this influence things? Monroe Doctrine, that 200 years of isolation thought is going to be part of the reason that World War II, the US takes so long to get involved. So, let me go ahead and finish. I want to go to this right here. Nope, not that. Hold on just a second. Nope, not that either. This. So I wanted to finish up the 4 time eras, and then I'm going to go back to something. So in between World War I and World War II, the US kind of pulls back big time. They don't get involved in much of anything. And there's a lot going on. I mean, because you see Hitler taking over and the Bolshevik Revolution. There's a lot of stuff happening. Fascism is taking over in multiple areas of the world. Pearl Harbor happens, and with it, neutrality and isolationism, they go with it, with that attack. And really from 1941 to today, isolationism has never really been a thought again as part of US foreign policy. The US is constantly involved in everything. For right after World War II, with the Cold War and fighting against the Soviet Union and communist forces, that moved right into the drug war, that moved right into the war on terrorism, and it's continued. That's probably where we still are now. And so U.S. involvement overseas has never gone back to pre-World War II levels. So I want to look at this one more time. So we're talking here about Spanish-American War, World War II, or World War I. Let me show you how this could lead to some questions, okay? So, 45, this question here, this is about World War I. So we've got a couple of multiple choice questions I want to show you about World War I. So give you a minute to work on 45. Give us a vote in the poll, in the chat about what number 45 would be, okay? And then we got 2 questions on this, and then we're gonna look at something else. Okay, seeing lots of answer choice A's in the chat, and it is, hey, very good. Yeah, at the very beginning, the US was, we want to stay out of this as long as we can. This isn't our problem. It's over there. The reason you guys are in this fight is because of entanglements. That's what is the reason for this, is entanglements. Haven't you learned your lesson? And now you want us over there. And the US is fighting it with everything they have. All right, number 46. So what changed? That's basically what this question is asking. What changed? So 46, minute to go, and put your answer in there. What was it that dragged us in? You didn't see that. So what was it that caused it to change? Shock, oh no. It's C, Germany began to practice unrestricted submarine warfare on the open seas. So you got to think, if you're an isolationist neutral country, what's going to drag you into an international war? It's not going to be because the Brits are getting messed up. It probably isn't even because they're trying to negotiate with Canada. It's going to be that now your boats are getting sunk. And that's really where the problem comes in. Okay. Now I want you to look at this next glorious question, okay? So this is a short answer question, that this off of the old test, okay? Off of last year's test. But it is something like what they could ask on this test. And you can see why I picked it, right? You can see, because one similarity between the treaties that ended the Spanish-American War and the treaty that ended World War I, or one difference between the US's involvement in the Spanish-American War or World War I, or one specific historical effect of. So, I mean, can you see how they're going to test your content knowledge by the questions? And so you've got to understand what caused the Spanish-American War versus what caused World War I. You've got to understand how the Spanish-American War ended versus how World War I ended. You've got to understand a long-term change from one and the other. And so this ends up being a really good demonstration of what to expect on the test, where doing content knowledge, doing multiple choice is going to it's really going to challenge you to make sure you have all of those little things down, all of those details and examples, because this is what they're going to want you to have. You've got to make sure that you're doing all parts of the prompt. So on this question, it doesn't say pick one. It says do all three. So you've got to come up with one similarity, one difference, and one effect. Now you only have to come up with one. That's the big thing. You don't have to show everything that you know. You just need to show one thing and show it well. You want to use complete sentences. You want to make sure that you have specific examples. And it doesn't matter like exactly how the test is going to be written. These are going to be the same no matter what. No matter what they end up asking you, they're going to want you to write it grammatically correct and in full sentences. They're going to want you to use specific examples. You don't just say the US didn't want people involved over here. You know, like give an example of what that meant, okay? And then the significance of those examples. So here's what I want you to do. I'm gonna put a timer up for let's do a minute and a half. Can I do it in a minute? I just want to see if I can do a minute and a half timer. No. Let me I'll do two timers. I'll do two 1 minute timers until I can get a second. Let me yeah, we'll do a 1 minute timer and then we'll do another 1 minute. So I'm gonna give you 2 minutes and I want you to work on the first one. I want you to come up with a similarity between the endings of the Spanish-American War and World War I, okay? So come up with a similarity between those two. I'll give you 2 minutes to work on that, and you can throw your answers into the chat. So work on A, we're gonna give you 2 minutes, and then we'll do the same thing for B, and then we'll do the same thing for C, okay? Best of luck. All right, So I see that Dan put in for A, the loss of territories by the losing nations. Yeah, that is going to be one of the best examples of it. Definitely. There's also a couple others. You can see I put up there also both treaties recognize the independence of nations. Some nations that have been colonies were now independent. And later, both of them had very unsatisfying treaties where later on problems did develop. And so that's going to be a couple of different things. All right. So now I want to give you 2 minutes to work on letter B. What is one difference for their involvement? So that first one was similarities in the treaties. The second one is going to be differences in the involvements of it. And I think I've got a 2 minute. There we go. So 2 minutes, go for it. Okay, so yeah, that's a funky looking timer over there. I got the 2 minutes, but I don't know what those colors are all about. I'd like to change that in just a second. Yeah, I'll fix that for sure. So some differences I noticed. Let's see, Favor talks about okay, the Favor, I actually like that one. That one is one that I didn't see really pop up a ton, and but that actually is something that is true. It is true. Like the reason, like the smaller scale that one is the reason that the World War I launched was going to be the Archduke. But you got to remember, you answer the whole question, which is the U.S.'s reasons. So what was the U.S.'s reason for this? And the U.S. didn't get involved because of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. The U.S. got involved because of the, like we've mentioned on the previous question, German submarines started shooting boats out of the water. That was the big reason. But it's also, there were other reasons as well. And so, I mean, like here's a couple other ones that we can look at. So we did A, now we're on B. So they were wanting to get into the Cuban and the War for Independence because there were atrocities that they felt were being done. But in World War I, they did not want to get involved. That was like, there was a difference. Many Americans wanted to get involved for the Spanish-American War, but did not want to get involved in World War I. Another is the role of journalism. Because remember, yellow journalism and the sinking of the USS Maine, which wasn't really a thing, didn't really happen like the way that they said it did, and so it was just like, but that whole concept of journalism getting public opinion whipped up versus World War I, where there actually was not a lot of coverage of it as well. So let's go back. I just want to show you C. We don't really have time to go through all of C like we did with the other ones. But it says one historical event that was an effect of either one of them. So if we do that, if we go back and look at the answer for this one, something like this. We didn't have to compare on that. Like if you notice on C, it doesn't compare. It says one of either. And so the one of the most documentable ones would be how Germany was so crippled by World War I that it actually paved the way for Hitler to come to power. Because Germany was broke and their sense of national pride was destroyed, and anybody coming in promising them a new future was going to work. And that's, I mean, World War I, the treaty just like was cruel to Germany. And so that actually did directly lead to Hitler's rise. And so that's one effect. But there's other ones where one effect of the Spanish-American War is now the US has a mini empire and is a world player. Spain is not. Spain never is a world player again. That's another effect. And so as we go through these, and like the rest of the week, as we go through things like the Civil War and immigration and all of those things, always keep in mind, how can I link this to all of history? Like we mentioned the very first day, if you were here the very first day, I said history is not in a vacuum. Everything that happens is going to affect everything in the future. And so connecting that is going to demonstrate your understanding of history and also your knowledge of the content. And that's exactly what they're going to want you to have on the test. And so those are all going to be beneficial for you to keep doing that, to keep on trying to connect the dots on things, find those common threads. Tomorrow, we get to cover possibly the most covered topic in American history, and that will be the Civil War. And so we're going to talk about that tomorrow. And hopefully you guys can come back. I know at the top of the hour, you get to do bio with Ari and Nick, two of my favorite people in the whole virtual room. And I will see you guys tomorrow, I hope. Have an awesome afternoon.